Today I'm going to show you the entire punctuation system the SAT actually tests you on. I'm going to explain all the rules from start to finish. So the SAT tests you for 4 punctuation marks: the comma, the semicolon, the colon, and the dash. That's it. There are no apostrophes, no exclamation points, none of that. You only have 4 marks you're gonna have to worry about. And each one of them has a small fixed set of jobs it's allowed to do. By the end of this video, you're going to be able to look at any punctuation question and immediately know which mark is the correct one to use in every situation. Before we get into it, links to my free program and my paid program are in the description. I'm not going to hard sell them, they're just there if you want them. And if you've made it this far, go ahead and subscribe, it actually helps a lot. So today we're going to cover the 4 punctuation marks: the comma, the semicolon, the colon, and the dash. These are all the punctuation marks you really have for the SAT. Now, before we discuss the 4 punctuation marks themselves, there's one skill that every single rule we're going to discuss in this video is going to actually depend on. And that is going to be telling an independent clause apart from a dependent clause. And you have to do that really fast if you want to succeed. An independent clause has a subject, a verb, and it expresses a complete thought, meaning that if you isolated it and you dropped a period after it, it would be a real standalone sentence. It would make sense by itself. For example, the stock market opened lower on Tuesday. You have a subject, you have a verb, and you have a complete thought. The sentence just makes sense overall. That is an independent clause. However, a dependent clause also has a subject and a verb, but does not express a complete thought by itself. It's leaning on the rest of the sentence most of the time to complete the idea that it's trying to tell the reader. And the giveaway here is usually the very first word that you're gonna see. Words like because, although, since, while, if, before, though, unless, even though, whereas. All of these words mean that the second a clause opens with one of these, it becomes a dependent clause, no matter how complete it might sound otherwise. For example, here we have this sentence here. We have, because the stock market opened lower on Tuesday. You have the same words as before, but rearranged. But in this case here, you can see that it starts with because, and overall, just like left hanging, you don't really understand what the sentence is trying to tell you. The difference is here, okay, you have the same words in the sentence. However, the independent clause expresses a complete thought. However, a dependent clause does not do that. So here's the actual test you're going to use for every single punctuation question. You're going to cover up everything else except the piece you're checking. And you're going to ask one question. You're going to ask if, can this sentence stand alone by itself as its own sentence? If yes, then it's dependent. However, if it leaves you waiting for more context or you're just confused when you read it, it's dependent. And that takes you 2 seconds to check. So something else you have to watch out for is whether a sentence starts with words like who, that, and which. And when that happens, that means that the sentence is a dependent clause, whether it starts with one of these words or something similar to that. So when you've mastered this test here, this 2 second test, then we can move on to the next part of this video, which is going to be discussing each punctuation rule. And all of them really depend on this part here, which is identifying dependent and independent clauses. So first, let's start with commas, and commas cause the most problems for people. Not because they're really hard to understand, but it's because most people have really bad habits when it comes to using them. So whenever they see or they feel like a sentence is really long, instead of using a proper punctuation mark, they might just like add a comma randomly, or they might just default to using commas without really understanding why they're being used. And we're going to fix that here. We're going to fix that. We're going to explain each use case for the comma. So commas can be really used for 4 things only, and that's only 4 things. And number one, that's going to be separating items in a list. Let's read this sentence here. A well-organized study session requires a timer, a notebook, and a distraction free room. Notice how in this sentence you're using a comma to separate a list of items, and it's doing a very simple job here. Number two, that's going to be setting off a non essential detail in a sentence. Extra information that you could really delete from a sentence, and the sentence would work just fine. For example, in this sentence here, you can read that the Great Barrier Reef, the largest living structure on Earth, is visible from space. You can take it out, or you can just cross it out here, and you can reread the sentence again, and it would make sense. Let's read this again. So, the Great Barrier Reef is visible from space. The sentence still makes sense. And if you really want to figure out whether a detail, like in this case here, is essential or non essential to the sentence, you try and remove it. That's a test you could use. You'd remove it and you'd reread the sentence again without it. And then you can actually determine whether it's actually needed for the sentence to make sense. And in that case, you wouldn't use commas, but if it were a non essential item, then you'd use two commas to separate it in the sentence. Number three, that's going to be linking a dependent clause to an independent clause. You're going to use the 2-second test that we learned earlier to actually figure out whether a sentence requires a comma. In this case, you can read the sentence here. Although sea otters spend most of their lives in water, they are not classified as marine mammals. You can see that this part here is a dependent clause because if you read it by itself, it doesn't make sense. Although sea otters spend most of their lives in water. Alone, it doesn't make sense. And not only that, it starts with although. So that means it really is a dependent clause. And in this case, when you have a dependent clause at the start of a sentence, you need to put a comma. However, if the dependent clause was after the independent clause, then you wouldn't really use the comma. You have to watch out for this. And number four, that's going to be linking two independent clauses using a fanboys conjunction. What fanboys basically means, it's an acronym that describes all conjunctions like for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. That's basically what fanboys means. It's an acronym for all of these conjunctions. So let's read this sentence here. Chess grandmasters often study for over a decade, yet natural talent still plays a role. So in this case, you're using a comma to link two independent clauses here. You have one independent clause, and then you have another one, and you're linking it using a comma and a conjunction here, a fanboys conjunction in this case. So now let's discuss some common traps while using commas. So number one, that's going to be splitting a subject from its verb. For example, coral reefs are extremely sensitive to temperature change. That is wrong because there's really no reason for a comma to just be there. It's sitting between the subject and the verb doing nothing. And the only time you really see that is when you'd actually be using a non essential phrase. The only time you'd see a subject being split from its verb is when you're using a non essential phrase that would be boxed in between two commas, like you've seen earlier. And how it would look like. It would look like this. So, coral reefs, which cover less than 1% of the ocean floor, are extremely sensitive to temperature change. That's the only case when you'd split a verb from its subject, is when you'd add a non essential phrase between the two, like you've seen earlier and discussed earlier. That is the fix to this common trap. So, trap number two, never put a comma before the object of a verb. The marathon runner sprinted toward the finish line. That is wrong because there's no job that a comma is doing there. You need to fix this by just writing the marathon runner sprinted towards the finish line. That is the fix to this problem here. You just remove the comma. So trap number three, never used a comma in a two-item list. Now I've discussed earlier that you use a comma to separate a list of items, but you only do that when it's more than three items. And in this case, they've added a comma for two items, which is wrong. So photosynthesis requires sunlight and water. In this case, you want to eliminate the comma because it's a two-item list. you just write sunlight and water. So the full sentence would be photosynthesis requires sunlight and water. So just remember that when you have a two item list, you don't want to use a comma. But when you have a list that's more than two items, then you'd want to use a comma to separate the list of items. So now let's discuss semicolons. Now, semicolons are actually simpler than commas, even though they might seem more complicated because they're really unfamiliar to you. You've never really used semicolons naturally, except for when you're studying for the SAT. However, once you know them, once you understand semicolons, semicolon questions are going to be one of the easiest points on the test. So, job number one, they have two jobs. One of them is linking two independent clauses with no conjunction. So, that's the same thing as linking two independent clauses using a conjunction, but in this case, instead of the comma and the conjunction, you're just going to use a semicolon. And whenever you want to do this, you just want to check real quick if, okay, is this side of the sentence here, is it a dependent or independent clause? Just run the 2 second test in this case. Just run the test of whether it's a independent or dependent clause. And then you can actually tell whether you can actually use a semicolon. So in this case, both sides are independent clauses. So you can actually use a semicolon in this case. So now let's discuss the second use case of a semicolon. And that's going to be separating a list with internal commas. And now this is much more uncommon than the first use case. It shows up way less than the first one, but it actually shows up from time to time. So let's read this phrase here. Offices in Austin, Texas, Portland, Oregon, and Denver, Colorado. This phrase here is actually a list of items, but to actually separate the list of items that are composed of commas, and you can see that each list item here is composed of a comma here. The way to separate this list of items, you'd use semicolons. So now let's move on to colons. Now colons have one thing that you need to check before anything else, and that's going to be the 2 second test. Because what comes immediately before the colon has to pass as a complete independent clause. If it doesn't, then the colon is automatically wrong. You can't have a dependent clause preceding a colon. So once you complete the 2 second test, you can actually test whether you actually need a colon or not. So for the first use case of a colon, it introduces an explanation. Let's read the sentence here. Roman engineers solve a problem that still challenges builders today. How to move water uphill without pumps. Now notice how the colon here introduces an explanation after it. How to move water uphill without pumps. And notice how the sentence before the colon is actually a complete sentence. It's an independent clause. So here in this case, you can use a colon because you have an independent clause and after it, you have an explanation. Now for the second use case, it introduces a list. Glaciers form under a specific combinations of conditions. Low temperatures, high snowfall, and enough time for compression. Notice how you have a independent clause before the colon, and then you have a list. These are the two use cases for a colon. Number one, that's going to be introducing an explanation and introducing a list. But make sure to use the 2 second test to know whether you have an independent clause before the colon, and then you can actually use it. Now let's discuss dashes. And they really only have one job, and that's going to be setting off a non essential piece of information from the rest of the sentence. Functionally, the same job as the parrot comma trick that you've learned at the beginning of the video. Just a different look. It's a dash instead of a comma in this case. So let's look at the first example. Three ancient inventions, the wheel, the printing press, and the compass, reshaped how humans moved, communicated, and explored. Now notice how if you remove this part of the sentence here, the rest of the sentence would still make sense. You can read it without it and you'd see that, okay, three ancient inventions reshaped how humans moved, communicated, and explored. The sentence still makes sense without this non-essential phrase here. You can also use one dash, like in this case here, instead of two dashes, like in the first case here. So you can just add the non-essential phrase at the end, and you can just use one dash instead of two. Like in this sentence here, three ancient inventions reshaped how humans moved, communicated, and explored. And then you'd have the non essential phrase at the end: the wheel, the printing press, and the compass. If you have anything else other than these two cases here, then it's wrong. Now let's gather everything that you've learned so far and put it towards a practice question. Now this should be easy after everything that you've learned. Now if you followed this video from start to finish, this question should be super easy. So now let's read it. Marine biologists have found that the reason certain deep sea jellyfish continue to emit light even after blank is that specialized proteins in their tissue remains chemically active after the animal has died. And here you have four choices here. You have A, B, C, and D. First, let's run the 2-second test on this sentence here to actually figure out whether it's an independent clause or a dependent clause, because that will actually help us eliminate some of the answer choices that we have over here. Marine biologists have found that the reason certain deep sea jellyfish continue to emit light even after. Okay, so this sentence here isn't really that complete. It doesn't give you a complete meaning because in the end of the sentence you have even after. Even after what? Really don't know what this sentence is trying to say. So this sentence here is actually a dependent clause. So this sentence here is a dependent clause. So that allows us to eliminate two answer choices. That's going to be B and C, because colons and semicolons require an independent clause before them to actually be used. And in this case, you have a dependent clause, so we can automatically eliminate them. So that leaves us with two answer choices. You have A and then you have D. Well, in this case, A doesn't really make sense, because why would you have a comma when you don't really have a non-essential item to be boxed off? You don't even have a list, and you don't even have a conjunction or a coordinating conjunction like because, although, whereas. So in this case, you can actually eliminate A. So that leaves us with answer choice D in this case. No punctuation mark at all. And that's actually correct because dying here is just a gerund, completing the phrase even after dying, which flows directly into is that. It really needs nothing to separate it from the rest of the sentence. And this is the exact kind of question people get wrong, not because it's really hard, because the instinct here is that, okay, you need to have any kind of punctuation mark. Well, in reality, you can sometimes not even need the punctuation mark, like in this case here. So, in conclusion, from this video, you're going to have four checks to memorize. You're going to have to actually check whether a clause is dependent or independent by covering it up and actually checking if it stands alone, like using the 2-second test that we've discussed throughout this video. And for semicolons, you're going to want to check if the sentence is independent on both sides, before the semicolon and after the semicolon. And you're going to do that by using the test that we have here. As for colons, you're going to have to check whether there is an independent clause before it, and then you can actually use a colon. As for commas, you're going to check whether it's doing one of its four jobs. So that's really the whole punctuation mark system for the SAT. You have four punctuation mark, and each one of the punctuation marks has its own job, its own system that it has to follow. Also, make sure to check out my free program and my paid program. My paid program is actually the best way for you, your best chance to get a 1500 on your SAT. So make sure to check it out. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. It's free and it costs you nothing and it helps me out a lot.